All right, let's go. Number 10. Ailes. In 1944, American signals intelligence personnel intercepted a Soviet diplomatic cable transmitted from Washington to Moscow. The cable entered the Venona Project, a classified effort to retroactively decode Soviet intelligence communications using partial breaks in the encryption system. When the cable was eventually decrypted, it described an agent inside the United States government identified only by the cover name Ailes. The description was specific: a State Department official with access to diplomatic communications and policy deliberations at the senior level, who had attended the Yalta Conference in February 1945 and who was passing material to Soviet intelligence through a GRU handler in Washington. The CIA, FBI, and NSA spent years attempting to match the Ailes description to a confirmed identity. The most commonly proposed candidate is a former State Department official who was investigated multiple times, convicted of perjury in connection with the investigation, and maintained his innocence until his death in 1996. The identification has never been confirmed. The FBI's files on the case remain partially classified. Other researchers have proposed different candidates, other Yalta attendees whose access matched the cable's description. Ailes produced intelligence. Ailes attended Yalta. Ailes had a handler. The cable exists. The person does not. But here is where the Ailes case becomes more than a historical mystery. The Venona decrypts, declassified in 1995, identified hundreds of Soviet agents operating inside the United States government during the 1940s. Ailes is one of the most specifically described. The cable contains enough identifying detail that investigators have narrowed the candidate list significantly, and yet after decades of investigation by agencies with full access to the classified record, the match has never been formally made. The cable is in the archive. The person it describes attended Yalta, passed intelligence to Moscow, and died without confirmed attribution. Number 9. The Fifth Man. In 1963, Kim Philby defected to Moscow. By the time investigations concluded, 5 members of a Cambridge-recruited Soviet network had been identified: Philby, Guy Burgess, Donald McLean, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross. The official number is 5. The evidence suggests the number is wrong. Multiple investigations conducted by British and American counterintelligence across the following decades identified patterns of intelligence loss that the 5 confirmed members could not fully account for. Specific classified information appeared in Soviet files, access through defector debriefings and partially declassified material that none of the 5 had access to at the time it was passed. The British Security Service's internal investigation, conducted in the 1970s, identified a list of possible additional members that included senior figures in the British establishment. The investigation concluded without charges. The list remained classified for decades. When elements of it were eventually released, the individuals named had died. Peter Wright, the MI5 officer who conducted much of the internal investigation and wrote about it in his memoir, concluded that the Cambridge network almost certainly had additional members who were never identified. He named one specific individual, a former Director General of MI5, as a suspect. The allegation was never confirmed. The target sued the publishers. The case settled. But here is where the fifth man question reaches beyond British intelligence history. If the confirmed 5 members of the Cambridge network produced the damage the historical record documents, the exposure of Western intelligence operations, the identification of agents, the penetration of atomic research, and if additional members existed whose identities were never confirmed, then the full accounting of what was passed to Moscow during the network's operational years remains incomplete. The 5 known members have been investigated, written about, and archived for 60 years. The ones who were never identified remain inside that archive as absences, damage without attribution, losses without a name attached. Number 8. The Year of the Spy, the part nobody solved. In 1985, the CIA lost more assets inside the Soviet Union than in any comparable period in its history. The losses came in rapid succession. Soviet officers who had been working as CIA sources were arrested, disappeared from contact, or were publicly executed. The pattern was unmistakable. Something inside the CIA was feeding Moscow. The mole hunt ran for 9 years. In 1994, Aldrich Ames was arrested. The investigation had found its answer. Except it hadn't found all of it. CIA counterintelligence analysts who examined the 1985 losses against Ames' documented access found a gap. Ames had provided the KGB with a significant portion of the compromised sources. He did not have access to all of them. Several assets lost in 1985 were in programs and compartments that Ames's position did not give him visibility into. When Robert Hanssen was arrested in 2001, investigators re-examined the 1985 losses against Hanssen's access. Some previously unexplained losses could now be attributed to Hanssen, not all of them. The CIA's internal assessment, portions of which have been partially declassified, acknowledged the possibility of a third source operating during the same period, someone with access to programs that neither Ames nor Hanssen could account for, who was never identified. But here is where the unattributed 1985 losses carry an implication that the confirmed arrests do not resolve. Ames was arrested. Hanssen was arrested. The third source, if one existed, was not. The CIA closed the active investigation. The unattributed losses remained in the damage assessment as a category: sources lost, access unknown. Not Ames, not Hanssen, someone. That someone, if real, retired, or died, or is still alive. Number 7. The Iranian Network, source unknown. Between 2009 and 2011, the CIA's network of informants inside Iran was systematically dismantled by Iranian intelligence. At least a dozen sources were arrested. Several were executed. The network that American intelligence had spent years building inside one of its most critical targets was effectively destroyed in approximately 2 years. The CIA and FBI investigated the compromise for years. 2 primary theories emerged. The first was a technical failure. A covert communications system used by CIA sources inside Iran had been identified and penetrated by Iranian counterintelligence, allowing the Iranians to identify sources through their communications rather than through a human betrayal. The second was a human source inside the CIA who had identified the network to Iranian intelligence. The investigation did not definitively resolve which explanation was correct. The technical communications system was identified as vulnerable and subsequently taken offline globally, a decision that caused additional intelligence losses in other theaters. Whether the compromise was technical, human, or both was never publicly confirmed. But here is where the Iranian network's destruction carries an implication beyond the specific losses. If the compromise included a human source, that person had access to CIA operational files in one of the most sensitive denied areas on Earth and provided them to a foreign intelligence service. Those sources were executed. The person who may have identified them returned to their desk, their clearance, and their career. That source was never identified. The executed sources are in the record. The person who may have named them is not. Number 6. Cuba, beyond what was confirmed. In 2001, Ana Belén Montes, a senior Defense Intelligence Agency analyst who had spent 16 years inside the American intelligence community, was arrested for espionage on behalf of Cuba. She had passed classified information to Cuban intelligence across her entire career. After her arrest, counterintelligence investigators assessed the damage. They also assessed whether Montes had operated alone. The assessment concluded she likely had not. Cuban intelligence, the Directorate of Intelligence, known as the DI, had a documented history of running multiple simultaneous sources inside the same target institutions. The successful recruitment of Montes suggested an established capacity that was unlikely to have been applied to a single asset. The investigation identified other individuals for additional scrutiny. Some were investigated and cleared. Some cases were closed without charges because the evidence did not meet the threshold for prosecution. Whether those closures reflected genuine exonerations or insufficient evidence is not publicly known. But here is where the Montes case's aftermath changes what is knowable about Cuban intelligence penetration of the CIA and related agencies. Montes was inside DIA for 16 years before she was identified. The method that eventually identified her was an anomaly in her behavioral pattern that a specific analyst noticed and escalated, not a counterintelligence operation that had been specifically targeting her. The identification was in part accidental. The additional sources that the damage assessment suggested might exist with similar access, similar methods, without an equivalent behavioral anomaly to trigger scrutiny were never confirmed as identified. The investigations closed. The cases sit in the classified record as unresolved. Number 5. The Counterintelligence Penetration. The most structurally damaging category of intelligence penetration is one that targets the counterintelligence function itself, the part of the apparatus whose purpose is to find spies. A penetration of counterintelligence does not just pass intelligence, it shapes what the mole hunt looks at and what it does not look at. It directs suspicion toward innocence and away from the guilty. It buries anomalies before they can be investigated. It is the most valuable asset a foreign intelligence service can recruit and the hardest to detect, because the person hiding the penetration is the person responsible for finding it. The CIA has experienced at least 2 confirmed cases in which counterintelligence functions were directly penetrated. Ames was assigned to the Soviet counterintelligence branch when he began passing information. Hanssen operated within the FBI's counterintelligence division for the majority of his espionage career. Both were eventually identified. In both cases, identification required years or decades longer than investigators later assessed it should have taken, in part because the mole hunt's own processes had been shaped by the penetration it was looking for. But here is where the confirmed cases produce the most uncomfortable implication. If Ames operated for 9 years inside counterintelligence before being identified, and Hanssen for 22 years, the question is not whether counterintelligence penetration is possible. The question is whether the ones that have been identified are the complete list. An unidentified penetration of the counterintelligence function would not appear in the record of identified penetrations. It would appear as successful mole hunts that found nothing, investigations that closed without resolution, and anomalies reviewed and attributed to other causes. That record exists. What it contains is not fully knowable from the outside. Number 4. The China Catastrophe. Between 2010 and 2012, the CIA lost virtually its entire network of human intelligence sources in China. At least 20 sources were killed or imprisoned. The losses were systematic, not the gradual attrition of normal counterintelligence operations, but a rapid, coordinated dismantling that indicated China's Ministry of State Security had identified the network in its entirety. The CIA and FBI launched a joint investigation. Multiple theories were developed. One centered on a Chinese-American CIA officer who was investigated extensively and eventually pleaded guilty to unlawfully retaining classified national defense information, a lesser charge than espionage that did not require proving intent to benefit a foreign power. Whether he was the sole source of the compromise was never publicly confirmed. A parallel theory identified a vulnerability in a covert digital communication system used by CIA sources in China, the same system implicated in the Iranian network compromise. The system's vulnerability may have allowed Chinese counterintelligence to identify sources through their communications metadata rather than through a human informant. The investigation did not produce a confirmed answer. The network was gone. The cause of its destruction was not confirmed. But here is where the China network's destruction reaches a scale that the individual case counts do not convey. Each of the 20 lost sources represented years of recruitment, an approach, a development, and assessment, a formal agreement, a communications protocol. 20 sources lost in 2 years means 20 recruitment operations, 20 cover stories, 20 families whose members were arrested or executed, and 20 years or more of combined access to Chinese government and military information that terminated simultaneously. The person or technical failure that produced that result has not been confirmed. The sources are in the record as losses. The cause remains disputed.
Number 3. The signals that pointed nowhere. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, American signals intelligence collection against Soviet military communications began producing anomalies that analysts could not explain. Specific collection programs, the methods, frequencies, and technical parameters of American intercept operations appeared to be known to Soviet signals security personnel, who adjusted their communications practices in ways that reduced collection effectiveness. The pattern suggested a source with access not to specific intelligence products, but to the technical infrastructure of American collection itself. The how of what was being intercepted, not just the what. That category of access pointed to a specific population: technical operations personnel, signals intelligence specialists, or officers with visibility into collection methodologies rather than finished intelligence. The investigation that followed identified several individuals for additional scrutiny. It did not produce confirmed arrests. The anomalies in Soviet signals security behavior eventually stabilized, which could indicate that the source had lost access, had been reassigned, or had ceased activity for other reasons. But here is where the signals anomaly investigation produced its most significant institutional consequence. A source with access to collection methodologies is more damaging than a source with access to finished intelligence, because knowledge of how collection works allows an adversary to modify behavior in ways that degrade collection without the source needing to identify specific programs or intelligence products. The source was never confirmed. The investigation closed. The anomalies stopped. Whether they stopped because the source was gone, or because the source had achieved what they needed and had no reason to continue, has no confirmed answer in the available record.
Number 2. The names that were never matched. The Venona Project produced one of the most significant counterintelligence archives in American history. The decrypted cables identified hundreds of Soviet intelligence sources operating inside the American government, the scientific community, and the defense establishment during the 1940s. Some were matched to real identities and are now part of the historical record. Others remained as cover names, KGB designations for individuals whose real identities the investigation never confirmed. The Venona cables were released in 1995. The release included a list of unresolved cover names, agents described with enough specificity to establish that they were real, that they had access to significant classified information, and that they passed that information to Soviet intelligence, but whose identities decades of investigation had not confirmed. The list is not short. But here is where the unresolved Venona cover names produce their most specific implication. The cables were transmitted in the 1940s. The sources they describe were active more than 70 years ago. Most or all of the individuals involved are almost certainly dead. The damage they caused, whatever intelligence they passed, whatever operations they enabled, whatever consequences followed from their access, occurred in the historical period. But the fact that these individuals existed, had access, passed intelligence to a hostile foreign power, and were never identified, means that the complete accounting of Soviet penetration of the American government in the 1940s remains an open file. The names in the cables exist. The people behind the names do not have confirmed faces.
Number 1. The open file. Every confirmed spy in the history of American counterintelligence, Ames, Hanssen, Walker, Philby, Blake, was at some point before their arrest an unidentified penetration. The file on each of them, for some period of time, was exactly like every case on this list. Damage confirmed, source unknown. The counterintelligence community's term for an unidentified penetration is UNSB, unknown subject. Every UNSB case begins as an anomaly, an operation that was blown, a source that disappeared, a collection program that stopped producing, an adversary that changed behavior in ways suggesting foreknowledge. The anomaly is investigated. Sometimes the investigation finds the source. The Ames investigation ran 9 years and found him. The Hanssen investigation ran longer and required a Russian source to provide his identity. Some investigations run and find nothing, not because nothing was there, but because the source was careful enough or lucky enough or had already ceased activity when the investigation began. The cases on this list are open files that were closed without resolution. Investigations that ended not with an arrest, but with a notation that the available evidence did not permit a confirmed identification and that no further active investigation was warranted. But here is where the open file is not a historical condition. The CIA's counterintelligence mission does not operate on a completed historical record. It operates on an ongoing assessment of current penetrations, sources inside the current intelligence apparatus whose identities are not yet known. Every generation of the intelligence community has produced confirmed penetrations that were, for years before their identification, unknown. The logic of that pattern does not permit the conclusion that the current moment is different, that the historical sequence of unidentified penetrations has ended with the last confirmed arrest. It permits only the conclusion that the currently unidentified penetrations have not yet been identified. The files without names are the ones that matter. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now, and make sure to subscribe.